First of all, welcome. My name is Mateusz Strużyński. I'm the director of the Institute of Classical Philology, and I want to welcome you all to the first panel discussion in our Tyranny and Democracy series. And today we have, first of all, 4 panelists, our 4 speakers who have delivered their lectures in the first part of the series. So first we have Edmund Stewart from the University of Nottingham. Hello, Edmund. Then we have our next second speaker, Professor Edward Harris, University of Durham. Hello, Edward.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good.
Perfectly. Then we have James Kierstead from the Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Hello, James.
Hello.
And from the same university, we welcome Xavier Marquez. Hello, Javier. Okay, and welcome also to the audience. What we will do today is we will have, I hope, a fairly spontaneous discussion, but within certain frameworks. So first, I'm going to ask a general question to all the speakers, and we will devote some time to summarizing or restating the theses of their lectures that we already had the opportunity to hear. But in the meantime, you can of course think of questions you would like to ask our speakers, or comments you would like to make, or other points you would like to raise. And then, so if you have a question or a comment to make, then just raise your hand using the MS Teams app. So this is above the comments you would like to make, the boxes or with other points people you would like to raise. In them, you have a series of icons. So the third from your left should be an image of a raised hand and smiling face. So you can use it to indicate that you want to ask a question or make a comment, and then I will bring you into the discussion. If there are no questions at a certain point, I have some questions to our speakers as well, so I hope we will have a kind of a freely flowing discussion with some structure. Okay, so first of all, we have heard 4 lectures on tyranny and democracy in ancient Greece, in the ancient world, but also with references to contemporary state of affairs, because we have a sort of interdisciplinary approach here. And I hope today we can also refer freely to the contemporary world, to how the notions we use have changed throughout the centuries, or what we can learn from ancient Greeks and Romans. So first, I want to ask the speakers to briefly, in a few minutes, to summarize their lecture, the main thesis or the main point they made, and to say maybe a few words how the other contributions from other speakers are connected to what they had to say, or maybe some thoughts that have arisen since their lecture in our discussions and with relation to other talks. So first, I mean, we can stick to the order of lectures. So Edmund, Edward, James, and Javier. So first, please say in a few words what you wanted to say in your lecture and how it connects to all of the things that we have heard up until now. So Edmund, go ahead.
Great, thank you. And yes, I have to say, from listening to the lectures of my 3 panelists, I have most certainly learned a great deal. And I think what I'm about to say should be a lot clearer than perhaps anything that I said at the start, from the thoughts that have been generated over the last term. So essentially what I was trying to say, and I think I've got this quite clearly in a nutshell now, is that our Greek views of from the thoughts that have been generated, tyranny, and indeed the Greek concepts of how to categorize a constitution and a form of government. And now Javier may disagree with me on this, I don't know, but I think are actually in many ways much more nuanced and in some ways much more effective than our simple dichotomy that we find in most modern thought between democracies and non-democratic or authoritarian regimes. Because this term authoritarian regime, I think, is deliberately vague, so we can apply it to people like Kim Jong-un, who is obviously a tyrant, and we can also apply it to people who are obviously leaders of authoritarian regimes, but we don't want to call these people tyrants. And Mohammed bin Salman, for example, in Saudi Arabia, would be an example of this. But I think the Greeks actually had, in some ways, a much simpler and I think in some ways actually a preferable way of thinking about this. So which has also been misunderstood in modern scholarship. So we tend to think of terms as either being descriptive or pejorative. And so there is this notion that in scholarship that the word tyrannos started off being merely descriptive. It simply meant ruler. It just indicated someone who has power of some kind. And then it went through a period of evolution and became a pejorative term. And we have Aristotle and Plato to blame for this. But as I suggested in the lecture, this is actually wrong. In fact, the term tyrannos or tyrannis is both descriptive and to a certain extent, well, I wouldn't say it's pejorative, but it is a negative term. And why is this, or what does this mean? Well, for one thing, and we can see this, for example, most particularly in tragedy, where it's possible for a supporter of a regime, a slave or an underling of some kind who's actually quite sympathetic to his or her masters, to out of earshot call a master tyrannos or refer to the rule as a tyranny. And yet none of these people call their masters tyrants to their face. And also it's very rare for anyone to actually admit that that person is actually a tyrant. Rulers will often, though, admit that they were tyrants when they've ceased to be. So how do we explain this problem? Well, from the ancient view, a tyrant is someone who can be objectively defined. And I think this is an important point. We can objectively define someone on the basis of wealth, on the basis of particularly a monopolization of wealth and a monopolization of power within that society. But we can think of it as in a pejorative or negative term, because from a Greek perspective, the monopolization of wealth or power leads inevitably to negative consequences. And it leads particularly to hubris. And I think we can see this. I mentioned the modern example of Mohammed bin Salman. And I was talking to an ex-Foreign Office person just a couple of days ago, and he said, "Oh, you can't call this person a tyrant." It's like, well, actually, I think Greek, looking at Mohammed bin Salman's career, and I think we can see this. I mentioned someone who has monopolized power. Bin Salman, and I was talking, imprisoned most of his relatives and created a reign of terror in Saudi Arabia that caused him to be most obviously the lead member in that family group. And he has amassed vast personal wealth, and there have been negative human rights and foreign policy, negative consequences for international relations that have followed from that. including the murder of journalists in foreign countries. So for that reason, I put to you that the word tyrannos is actually misunderstood, but it is actually a very effective term in thinking about politics in all periods. And there I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. And now we will move immediately to Edward Harris. And Edward, please, could you tell us briefly about your lecture?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm glad I followed on from Edmund, because I want to pick up several of his points with which I very much agree. First of all, tyranny is something in the ancient world, especially in the Greek world, which is always paired with another term. It's not always paired with democracy. The term democracy doesn't actually even seem to be coined until the late 5th century, probably about the 430s. And we don't find it in official documents, in the ancient possibly world, as early as about 410, which is always but paired, definitely not until after always paired with democracy. BCE. The term, contrast is in the early period, and even it's later on, is between tyranny and eunomia, which I'm going to call the rule of law. And in other words, and Aristotle also contrasts tyranny. He doesn't just contrast it with democracy. He also contrasts it with constitutional regimes in general. And he says that tyranny is not a politeia. He also then will characterize regimes, though, even democracies and oligarchies, of whether they are actually subject to the law or not. We'll get back to that. Also, again, to follow on from Edmund's point, I'm also going to bring up the point about rights, which I think is also very important, is that tyranny and tyrannos, again, they're negative terms from the, again, the late 5th century, late 7th century, all the way down through the classical period. The terms originate between about 650 and 600 BCE, and they're definitely well established by the time of Solon in 594 BCE. The question is, when and why did these terms arise? And I think to understand this, we need to understand the previous system of maintaining and gaining power in the Homeric period, that is probably from around 700 BCE, before the new constitutional law regimes come in. And as I discussed in my talk, the main way of gaining power and maintaining power was to have a band of followers called hetairoi, to have military success, to have generosity, again, to the community from wealth, which was acquired by slave labor. And we now thinly deny that slavery was important in the Homeric period. This is now in the last 10 years or so. This position we found is completely is not in accord with the sources. Slavery is very important, and slave labor is important, and also the concept of slavery. Second, the fourth would be marriage with elite families and protection money, which was gained by the community. And then also the last one, the use of personal ties with xenoi, which are guest friends who can be called on to provide help in a crisis or for overseas expeditions. The main thing is that in this form of government, power is personalized. It's a personal possession. Because it's a personal possession, it can be handed on to one's children, or it can be kind of given, parts of it can be divided up and given, as Agamemnon wants to give parts of his power over villages to Achilles in his offer in book 9, excuse me. Now, what happens is after this, the beginning, uneven development before, by 650 going down to the classical period when most of the cities in around Athens and Sparta in the Peloponnese and in central Greece have a kind of constitutional regime. Again, it's not called democracy yet. And these are characterized, again, by several features. The aim is to protect the freedom of citizens. I'm going to get back to that concept of freedom. And the main way to protect the freedom of individual citizens is by decentralizing power. And this is very important. One, you have boards of officials as opposed to individuals holding a certain type of power. Two, you have election or appointment to office. Three, very important, short terms of office. Four, very important, accountability. After your term of office, you can be held to account. You have to present your accounts. And as Pierre Froelich has shown, this is something we find in both democratic and non-democratic constitutional regimes. Five, decisions by majority rule. And then six, also entrenchment clauses, an attempt to privilege certain norms as more stable and more permanent than other norms, and other norms have to conform to them. So we get a beginnings of an idea of kind of constitutionality. And so this is the other thing is that one, ideally, again, leaders should use persuasion to gain obedience and their following, as opposed to the use of force. So at any rate, what's going on here is at this point in development of constitutional government, they create kind of an opposite. The Greeks often think in pairs, and these pairs are used terms to kind of define each other. And constitutional government then sees as its opposite what Edmund was saying, the concentration of power in the hands of one person, which will to the freedom and the rights of individuals, and that the tyrants that we see and are described, for instance, by Sistratus or the tyrants of Corinth, are basically those who are exercising power in the old ways. And the problem is about this in terms of our sources is that these people who are called tyrants, we never get their side of the story, and the side of the story is always being written by people or the constitutional regimes, or basically those who are portray these people who have the power ways in their hands. The problem is about personal means in the worst possible is that ways. We never these people the only positive kind of I think portrayals of say Sicilian tyrants are in the odes of Pindar, where they are not called tyrants. They're called they are seen as good leaders who are who rule in accord with justice. I'll come back to other points about rights later, but that is to summarize the main points in my talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Edward. And now James.
Thanks, Matthias. Yeah, I think so. The main point of my talk was just to introduce this mechanism, this very simple mechanism, which I've called the tyrant's dilemma. It's not the term is used in the literature in other ways, but I wanted to use it in this way. And that's the tyrant's dilemma is basically that the tyrant wants to clamp down on information and criticism. Why? Well, one reason is because the tyrant doesn't like it. No one likes to be criticized. The tyrant wants to shut down criticism because it's kind of annoying. But they also want to shut down criticism because they don't want to get the collective ball, the ball of collective action rolling against them. They don't want other people to be able to signal that they dislike the tyrannical regime because that risks it being overthrown. And because of this, the tyrants are kind of limited in what they can do. Democracies are much better at taking in information in that way. I started with a passage from Herodotus 578. In which Herodotus says that Isagoria, the victory of the Athenians against the Chalcidians in the Boeotians, shows how fine a thing Isagoria is, not only in one way, but in every way. It's a bit unsure what he means in that passage because he's talking about military victory. And he has an explanation in that passage which sort of doesn't accord with his own explanation. He says the reason that the Athenians were so much better at war against the Chalcidians and the Boeotians is because they didn't have tyrants ordering them about. They weren't fighting on behalf of tyrants, and therefore the Democrats were fighting for their own freedom. So that doesn't seem to have anything to do with Isagoria, which is about this about the freedom of speech, equal speech. But I think that Herodotus does have a glimmer of this explanation that I've been outlining, this tyrant's dilemma, because in other parts of his work he seems to have his finger on it. And I'm thinking there about the Wooden Wall Oracle in particular, where it seems like in the Citizen Assembly, even though the Athenians have cosmologoi, they have these religious experts, these experts in soothsaying and oracular responses, they don't actually just go along with what the experts say, the religious experts say. They actually are open to all sorts of different information and critiques coming in. So they actually end up going with the Themistocles view, which is that the wooden wall oracle refers to ships. So you can see how this basic mechanism would, in theory, make democracies superior at war, and that's why I think that this is probably, or possibly, what Herodotus had at the back of his mind when he was saying, you know, how fine a thing a Zagaria is. And then I tried to look at the modern literature on this. You know, is it true that democracies are better at war for this reason? And there is a modern literature. That's why, luckily for me, I suppose, you know, a lot of it does seem to say that democracies have a superior record at war. And then the two mechanisms that modern scholars seem to think are operative are, very interestingly to me, the two that we've just talked about. I mean, there are other things that people mention in the modern literature, but one mechanism they go back to is that, yeah, soldiers are more motivated in democratic states because they're fighting for themselves, which is just what Herodotus said. That's the explanation that Herodotus put for the Athenians beating the Chalcidians and the Boeotians in 506. And then the other one is the one that I think Herodotus had at the back of his mind, as it were, the one that maybe is operative in the wooden wall oracle, and that's the stuff about information, that democratic states are better able to discuss things openly, and that helps them in war. And actually, the modern literature seems to suggest that it's not so much a question of tactics, although that does come into it. It's not so much that they have the best tactics because they're able to discuss, you know, when to attack and when to retreat and things like that. It's more that on the sort of grand strategic scale, democracies are much better at knowing when to fight at all and when to hold back. So they don't initiate war unless they win. So the vast majority of wars that they enter, democracies actually win. This is in the modern period. So yeah, so that's it. So basically that's the mechanism I wanted to point towards in my talk. And I suppose that I wanted to point at something which I think is operative both in the ancient and the modern worlds. And I think all of these papers, to differing extents, are pointing to something, or pointing to ways in which tyranny or autocracy, there are continuities there. I think that Xavier's paper is probably a good segue to Xavier. I think Xavier was the one who most pointed towards differences between ancient and modern democracy and tyranny in this way. So I'll hand over to Xavier.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, James. So Xavier, please.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah, a little. It seems a little quiet to me, but maybe you could turn your mic on more. Okay.
Right to see. So as James was saying, my paper tried to point to what I see as some fundamental changes that happen in the sort of the terminology by which we refer to political pathology, problematic political. And my sense, which is, I think Edward and Edmund in different ways sort of disagreed a bit with, is that tyranny is in the classical philosophers, in Plato and Aristotle especially, but in well, is primarily a problem of government for the sake of private interest. That is also unjust government for the sake of the private interest of the tyrant, and it's framed as a moral problem, both from the point of view of the tyrant. Tyrant has bad character. It is a bad life. People should be discouraged from it. But also, you know, especially in something like Plato's Republic, in the famous discussion of the emergence of tyranny from democracy, as a problem of, you know, the character of the population leading to bad government itself. And I think the focus was primarily on a person, right? So the tyrant is a single individual rather than simply a kind of institutional structure. It is a regime, contrasted to other regimes, primarily in my view of it, monarchy, not to say just democracy, but to monarchy as ruled by one person that is done for the common good rather than for private interest, in accordance with law rather than against it, and so on, right? So I guess what I was trying to argue is that we don't speak that much about tyranny in scholarship anymore. The term is still used. We haven't abandoned it, but we have layered it with a series of other terms, many of which come from a very different tradition, which is what I focus on dictatorship as a kind of Roman legal term for thinking about rule that has a certain legitimation structure, right? So it's about an emergency rule without using that can set aside the constitutional structure to deal with a particular problem. And that in the 17th century becomes entangled with a new discussion about sovereignty, about the legitimation of the sovereign. And so the dictator appears as a kind of use of sovereign power, where the question is, to what extent is the dictator a sovereign per se, or a commissioner or a delegate of sovereign power that is empowered appears as a kind of use of sovereign power, some constitutional problem or or situation. And I think many of the other terms that we use in discussing problematic political rule today come from similar concerns about legitimation, right? And in particular, consent. So if dictatorship is about emergency rule, authoritarianism seems to me to be about the abuse of authority, about ruling without having the appropriate authority or engaging in practices that undermine the ability to legitimate those practices. And similarly, some of the other terms that we have come from similar concerns with authority and sovereignty. Now, I don't think this is all bad. I think we can think of it as a kind of layering of concepts. As Edmund was mentioning, we use this term authoritarianism, and clearly many regimes and many patterns of rule that we would call authoritarian in some way don't necessarily involve tyranny. So there's a different emphasis in what problem is important when we talk about authoritarianism than when we talk about tyranny. We can still talk about tyranny today, insofar as tyranny involves government in the private interest of somebody, personal power, personal rule without unconstrained by set of law and so on. But that might not be the problem we wish to focus on when we speak about authoritarianism, or when we speak about autocracy, or when we speak about despotism. It's the other term that I tried to trace a bit. Where there the problem would be about why do people submit to certain forms of arbitrary authority, right? So what I was trying to say is that there's a change of emphasis in what theorists consider the appropriate problem to focus on when we focus on problems of political rule. And we have new terms that are layered on top of the older concern with tyranny as personal rule or the private interest of the tyrant. And those terms allow us to speak about problematic forms of rule that are more impersonal, perhaps, and not necessarily connected with some of those earlier problems, without necessarily having to set aside the earlier way of thinking about them.
Thank you, thank you, all of you. I think we have now a much clearer picture of the four lectures and how they show this problem of tyranny and democracy from different angles. So I wanted to ask Edmund Stewart about about the relationship between the tyranny as a one-person form of government with the what might be called the tyranny of the many or tyranny of majority, which was already discussed in antiquity. And I want still this question to hang in the air. But I realized I wanted to ask something else when you, Edmund, when you were talking about your lecture, namely. So perhaps you can answer both and or sort of mingle them into one answer, because you emphasize the fact that a tyrannos in this classical sense is someone who monopolizes power, but also wealth, and for the benefit of his family, and uses family connections and friends. So there are several aspects and in a way criteria that you mentioned. So could you comment on a situation from this classical ancient perspective, but not only, on a situation when we have a person in contemporary politics, we see that happening, a person who rules in a very tyrannical or dictatorial way, using violence, but there are no other components that you mentioned. So there is no personal financial gain, there is no accumulation of wealth, there are no privileges for the family of the tyrant. So an example that comes to my mind, and maybe it's not a perfect example, but a communist dictator in Poland, Władysław Gomułka, who ruled between 1956 and 1970. He was the first secretary of the Communist Party in Poland. At least the legend is that he led a rather ascetic life personally. So of course he had some villas stolen from pre-war rich people in which he could live, but he didn't seem to accumulate wealth or to spend lavishly or to promote his family. He was certainly an ideologue who was at least appeared to be this very ascetic, severe tyrant, and he was obviously violent because in 1968 he repressed students. He led to the anti-Semitic campaign, which led many Polish intellectuals to leave the country, and then he ordered to shoot the workers in 1970. So there's clearly violence and ruthlessness, but and we can also probably point to other totalitarian dictators like that, who would not fit into this image of tyrant giving, like in Plato, trying to fulfill his desires and for pleasure, for wealth, and for fame. And we could probably find other examples. What comes to mind is Robespierre, for instance, but he was very briefly, of course, a tyrant. But in Andrzej Wajda's movie Danton, there is this marvelous scene between Robespierre and Danton, when Danton says, well, why are you so stiff? Enjoy your life, you have to be a normal person. But Robespierre is, at least as played by Wojciech Przoniak, he is this ascetic, insane dictator. So how would you comment on that? And I would be also interested in other speakers. What do you think of this case study?
Thank you. That's a very interesting and worthwhile point, and you're quite right to pick me up on it. Yes, I mentioned wealth because wealth is mentioned continually, and actually from quite an early point. So for as a connection with Tyrannies. So for example, in Simonides' fragment 7, which probably is 7th, 6th century, he says that he's talking about all the bad types of women, and one of the types is the one that's very expensive, always going off with a credit card, on the shops and stuff like that. So he says that only a tyrant could afford to keep this wife. So this is kind of like a sort of a Mrs. Mugabe kind of character. So yeah, there's a very strong connection with wealth, but I think we need to think about, well, what is wealth for? And of course, wealth is, can be for lavish, luxurious lifestyle, which was enjoyed by the families of many tyrants and the tyrants themselves. And thinking of people like Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, etc. But really, I think that the real point is the wealth is a source of power. It's being able to spend money on mercenaries, to be able to support the power, is being able to bribe people to support you. So really, I think it is a means to an end, which is that monopolization of power, and where we can see the monopolization of power most clearly, I think, is in the monopolization of wealth, or at least having a greater set of resources than anyone else in the polis. And it's interesting you mention Plato, because here I think this is an instance where people like Julia Annas, who I mentioned in my talk, misunderstand the eros of the tyrannical soul in Republic 9. And this is actually, I was just trying, when you were speaking, I was just trying to find a reference that there is actually an article which makes this exact point beautifully, and I'll send you the reference when I find it. But it's not actually, the tyrannical eros is not just lust for sexual pleasure or drunkenness or something. These are the minor erotes which sort of feed the big drone, the big eros. And I think really what the big eros is lust for, it's desire for everything. And I think that's the desire for having the whole world, the whole polis. And it's actually in the democratic phase of the democratic man where it's the loose living is most evident, because these little desires feed the massive desire. And I think when you go, it's interesting, Annas actually mentions Hitler and says, well, Hitler wasn't actually that much of a sort of, he lived a fairly simple life and probably was mostly asexual. But actually that misses the point. What was his desire? His desire was to control the whole world and to destroy most of it. So I think actually that there is a point of confusion there, and I think Plato actually this is why I think Plato's views actually fit much better with these kinds of examples than perhaps people would suggest. But just very quickly, the point about tyranny of the majority, also a very interesting question. I think there are a number of points here, and I'm going to go very quickly and invite other people to. So Greeks think of tyrant mostly as rule by one man, and this, I think, again, is a problem because we recognize today that actually, and certainly in the modern world, that tyranny is not ruled by one man. There must be a lot of people involved in keeping the tyranny going. And in reality, although we're talking about much smaller states and less complex states in the ancient world, ancient tyranny also involves a group, very often a family, but it is a group of supporters. And we can see this in, for example, the rule of Dionysius in Syracuse, where he's very much involving his brothers and people like supporters such as Philistus, and building connections as well through intermarriage. So it's really very much like a sort of mafia family. So there's that element. There's always got to be more people in a tyranny than just one tyrant, and there's a sense also of is tyranny, what is tyranny? Is tyranny just tyranny misliked, as Hobbes said, as I mentioned in my lecture? Is it just when we have an election in the modern world and a party that we don't like wins? You would not believe, if you look on, click up Tyrannos in Google Images, you would not believe the number of times Trump appears in one of those images. This, of course, is a very facetious and not very useful way of talking about tyranny, because parties, in the modern sense, and parties didn't exist in the ancient world, but parties are very fragile and very broad and unstable coalitions that can easily break apart. So I think in that sense, way of talking about tyranny, because parties use of the word in the modern sense, and parties didn't exist in the ancient world, or tyranny. But on the other hand, in the ancient world, people thought of, when they're using tyranny of the majority, when they say, oh, the democracy is a tyranny, what they mean is that the demos is a group which is a more than one people. It's lots of people in this group, but they have a very tightly knit set of interests, and they're a tightly knit group. And that they have gained power and they're ruling only in that group's interests. And again, to a certain extent, well, does that ever really happen? Can that really happen? I think there is one instance where I think it can, which I think is not the tyranny necessary of the majority, but the tyranny of hierarchy. And I think this is an interesting difference, where again we have the tyranny of really lots of people. I think there is one. So I think when we have a concentration of power, and I think tyranny it should always be associated, in my view, with concentration of power. We are seeing people, lots of different individuals have more power over others depending on how close they are to power. And I think, again, when we look at sort of societies such as the Soviet Union, how very hierarchical it is, and how based on how far you can get on was based on party membership and how far up the party you were. I think that's an instance where when power constricts, and when there is an opportunity to use power over others, actually we have a society where it's not so much the tyranny of the majority, but lots of tyrants, a hierarchy of tyrants, people tyrannizing everyone beneath them. And at the top of that, you have a leader who is dependent on this massive hierarchy of people abusing each other, or where the incentive always is to abuse the person beneath you or beside you, or indeed to pull down the person above you. So again, I think this is the tyrannical city described by Plato as well. This is a city which is characterized by fear and loathing and hatred and misery and confusion. But it is not exactly the same as what Plato described. It's a much more complex and a complex version of it, but it has in some ways much the same result. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking there.
Thank you. Do other speakers want to comment on what Edmund was talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, Javier, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that question of the sort of the clean living tyrant, so to speak, right? I mean, I remember reading a biography of Stalin's inner circle. So the Court of the Red Tsar by Montefiore, and Stalin does come out as somebody who is not particularly interested in material wealth. He's a workaholic who's invested in the ideological transformation of the world, but not especially concerned with sort of material comfort or sex or other the pleasures of the classical tyrant. And yet you clearly get the sense that this would be identified as a tyrant by the classical writers. Sort of he clearly is ruled by a passion to dominate, control the world, the classical tyrant, and yet you clearly get the sense. But this is identified as a tyrant. I would say that, like the modern terminology, writers, so helps a bit to understand what's going on, right? Because Stalin is not merely a tyrant; he's also ruling in a way it's justified through this whole concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That, these measures are justified for the sake of bringing the new world into being, and therefore we can not worry about constitutional constraints or legal constraints and so on. They're ruling in totalitarian ways, eliminating the distinction between public and private, and trying to control sort of the inner lives of Soviet citizens and so on. It's a despotism at the same time. Like, people have to conform in various ways. They have incentives to where it's rational to submit to this large-scale system of nation and so on. So there are different ways of thinking or talking about the phenomenon of what Stalin is doing, how Stalin rules, and so on, that go beyond the category of tyranny. Even though I agree that, even though Stalin personally was not particularly concerned with material possessions or wealth, I mean, he did have dachas and so on, but he didn't seem especially interested in the material side of things. There's clearly a tyrannical element to his rule. And perhaps I might say also something about that notion of the tyranny of the majority, which I mean, it's probably used to, Edmund, you mentioned that it was used in the ancient world as well. I associate it mostly with Tocqueville, and the idea there is sort of the tyranny of opinion, really, about how majority opinion can become a sort of compelling force, in the sense that you have to conform if you want to belong, and sort of this single common majority opinion becomes becomes tyrannical in this sense. But I'm guessing that in Tocqueville in particular, it's a fairly metaphorical notion in some ways. There's always a possibility of dissenting, even if you are cast aside from polite society, I guess.
Okay, thank you. We can now. I'd like to ask a question to Edward, but this will be connected to what we are discussing right now. So at any point, you can also jump in with your thoughts on that. Because Edward, you mentioned the notion of rights in your lecture. It's a very interesting thing, because clearly, when people are talking about the tyranny of the many or the majority, or they are discussing a possibility of democracy becoming a tyranny, usually the argument is that this happens when the rights of citizens are not respected. So the idea of the rights, individual rights, is seen as juxtaposed with the idea of democratia as a sheer power of demos. So I wanted to ask you, because you expressed an opinion that you believe that in ancient Athenian democracy there was a sort of a concept of citizen rights, if I understood you correctly. And recently, Tom Holland, in many times he raises this point, but also in his latest book, Dominion, he sort of says that it's an anachronistic way of thinking to ascribe to the ancient Greeks the idea of rights, citizen rights or human rights, because and he says it was a religious, the Athenian democracy, according to Holland, was a religious phenomenon in the sense that all the Athenians sprung out of the earth in a kind of a divine way, and this is the legitimization of their power as demos. So would you like to sort of elaborate on your opinion about this?
Yeah, Holland, there are all sorts of intellectual confusion there, and I'm going to try to pick it apart. First of all, Holland's view is not one, which is, Holland's not a professional historian. He's a popular writer. And he mainly actually been talking about Christianity. He wants to make a very facile sort of differentiation between the Greeks and Christianity, and he's trying to kind of emphasize the originality of Christianity. Now, there are differences, which we'll get back to, but he doesn't make a crucial distinction between the existence of legal rights and the justification actually been talking about. What he's really talking about, when he's talking about the power of the Athenian people going back to an ancestor, he's really talking about the justification of rights. He's not talking about the Christianity. Now, there are. Secondly, he's talking about collective rights as opposed to individual rights. And I think for this, the best thing to do is to read a quote by Miles Bernier, which was given in a talk in 1992 on BBC Radio 3. And I'm just going to quote him. There is no doubt that rights generally understood as legally protected claims exist in any interpersonal relationship of any kind. Even the most primitive social order must include rules specifying that certain individuals or groups have special permission to perform certain actions. Moreover, even the most rudimentary human communities must have rules specifying that some are entitled to tell others what they must do. Such rules, such communities, such rules ascribe rights. So there's no question that there is a concept of rights in the sense that you have a claim, and the claim I'd say that one I'm most familiar with are, for instance, property rights. The Greeks, not only the Athenians, but the Greeks have a sense of property rights. That means that anything that I own, I have certain claims against it. I can use it any way I want. I have the right to the fruits. I have the right to profit when it's sold. I have rights. It can't be interfered. No one can steal it. And if someone does try to interfere with my rights, I then have a legal procedure available to me that allows me to gain recompense. And this is, again, Aristotle in Book 5 of the Ethics certainly recognizes the rectificatory type of justice. Can't be interfered, that those whose rights are violated then have the right to have a claim against that person and or right to compensation. So there's no question that they do have a sense of rights. The question is, how do they justify them? And again, this gets into a long discussion, but they justify them in a different way. In other words, that if you're a member of a community, as for instance, you're an Athenian, you therefore kind of have rights, and you may also have additional rights. Beside these private rights, you have a right to, for instance, to sit in the law courts, you have a right to vote in the assembly, you have a right to be elected to office. Those are political rights as opposed to what we might call rights of individual rights. But they're not justified, and this is what Holland, I think, is getting at, in contrast to later views. For instance, in the American Constitution, one has this concept of universal and inalienable human rights. In other words, everybody, because everyone, qua human being, has certain kind of rights. And those are supposed to be protected. And of course, in the American Constitution, you have, the Bill of Rights. They're enumerated and they've been added on to. And I think people try to draw a simplistic differentiation between ancient concepts and modern concepts of freedom. And this goes back to an essay of Benjamin Constant, was published in the 1820s. And he makes a very simplistic view. He said the ancients were really interested in participating in the assembly and their in political office, and they didn't really care about these other, what he called kind of bourgeois rights, the rights of property, the rights to trade, and those sorts of rights. And I think that's Mogens Hansen, in a very good essay, I think, has shown this is a very simplistic contrast. Now, I think this goes, I just want to tie this back to what Edmund was talking about. Which is very important, is that the tyrant is not just someone who gains power for himself, but he violates the rights of individuals. And there are certain rights. One right is, again, right to property, and tyrants will violate that right by either confiscating property without cause, using it for themselves. The other one, which is key, which is talked about again and again and again, is putting citizens to death without a trial. That's apoctene,
right to property,
without a trial. And that again gets to a basic right, by which we have again with Solon, is that all Athenian citizens have a right to, again, a trial. They have a right to life, and life can't be taken away from them except for a just cause, which has to be proven in a court. The other one, of course, is that tyrants are notorious for their hybrizane of gynekes, in other words, sexual violence against women. And this is that free women are entitled to certain protections, again, in their bodies, and that a tyrant will violate these. Now, this is not the sort of thing which is associated with kind of the modern dictator. That's different. But this sense that a tyrant is, again, someone who, and I think this basic insight of the Greeks, which is still, I think, valid today, is that a person who is got too much power is going to have a lack of restraint, and that lack of restraint will end up by violating the rights of individuals, as well as, again, what James was talking about. James is more interested in the side about deliberation, and that's true. I think that's definitely true. The concentration of power will, tyrants, we'll get back to that later, tyrants are notorious for not taking advice, and because they don't take advice, they make bad decisions, and that's on a collective level. But I think we also shouldn't neglect the individual level, and I think what Edmund was also talking about, tyrants in the modern day also are notorious, again, for their violation of individual rights. The most egregious examples, of course, being under the regime of Hitler, which is very got very personalized, and also, of course, under Stalin, when again people were denied a right to a trial. But I want to get back to Javier's point, which he brought up very much in his lecture, and I think is very good, is that modern dictators are always show an interest in legitimating their power in a way that we don't find in the ancient world so much. And I think that's a very valuable point, and I basically agree with it. I just want to add to that. Hitler, I've just been reading Kierstead's biography of Hitler as kind of a preparation actually for today, and it was very useful. And the one thing is about Hitler is that he was at pains to kind of create this kind of facade of legitimacy. And last time, again, he was actually voted in. I mean, his powers, the Enabling Act, by which the Reichstag basically abolished itself on March 23rd of 1933. That was was a vote, and it was a majority vote. And then after that, he tried to constantly legitimate his power by holding plebiscites. And the plebiscites, I mean, after, for instance, the Rhineland was occupied again in 1936, he was wildly popular. And they held a plebiscite, and the official returns were something like 98%. Now, that was probably exaggerated, but even if you was an absence of that, it probably still would have been a vast majority. And there was genuine enthusiasm. And repeatedly, again, later on, not after the Second World War, but there was an attempt to create this kind of facade of legitimacy, often not only for internal consumption, but also for external consumption. And we must remember that you're absolutely right. I mean, Stalin sees himself, he never calls himself a tyrant, and I don't think anybody in Germany would have called Hitler a tyrant. But on the other hand, Hitler was quite happy with the title dictator, because it did have a kind of aura of legitimacy, which had been conferred on him, again, by the Enabling Act, but also, and then after Hindenburg died, of course, in 1934, he was given the title of, he took the title of Reichspräsident, which Hindenburg had had as another way of enhancing his legitimacy. And Stalin also, I mean, attempted to create this facade by the Constitution of 1936. And this was mainly for external consumption. And a lot of people actually were taken in by it. There were very many people on the left, for instance, in Britain, who were the Webbs were completely taken in by it. Said, oh, it's Hitler, look at all these constitutional guarantees which he's given. Again, trying to create a facade of legitimacy in a way that tyrants in the ancient world don't seem to have in the same way. So Javier, I very much agree with you. I think it was a valuable point. that you made. As far as that goes, I stop here. There may be things that people want to ask about.
Thank you. I'm sure the other speakers will want to comment on this, but I just wanted to make sure. Did I see a raised hand by?
I thought I did, but it disappeared.
Yes, I was trying to raise my hand, but if I may, to ask a very
Can you turn your camera on?
Yes, I am trying. Yes. Thank you very much for all your splendid papers, which I had the opportunity to listen to. I'm not a specialist in the subject, but I would like to ask one question, which is connected with Edmund Stewart's paper, and then to remarks very shortly on one point Professor Harris made in his lecture. So we are talking about politics, but I would like to ask you, what about the concept of gods as tyrants in ancient Greece? And can I ask another question to Professor Harris just now, or
yes, maybe just now?
Yes. And as far as I remember, you mentioned during your lecture the earliest instance of tyrannies or tyrannos in Archilochus piece. As far as I remember, it's fragment number 19. We can't be sure if this is used in a negative sense or not, but I would like to pay attention also to another fragment from Archilochus pieces. I mean the text very badly damaged, which we know from the papyrus. It's number 23, I'm not sure. When we find an expression, anase kai tyrannien eche, addressed to a woman, which we have here metaphorical sense of the idea of tyranny. So we can say that metaphorical usage of this word testifies to that fact that the concept of tyranny was very deeply rooted in so early society as Archilochus period or era. So it is perhaps worth mentioning the second instance. We reconstruct this word because 2 or 3 letters are missed, but we can be sure that there is another instance of this word by Archilochus. So I would like only to add these short remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question and a comment. Edmund, would you like to start to respond?
Thank you. Yes. So yeah, God's very interesting point. And again, I think this goes back to thinking about, well, I hope this is the case, that thinking about tyrannies as power, and not just any power, because there is a distinction between calling people who have power by lots of different names. An archon, for example, has power, but an archon is generally understood to have limited power. This is the case, that thinking about tyrannies as power, a tyrannos has no limits in theory on that person's power, although in practice there may be there may be some, and certainly no legal or no effective legal limits on that power. So I think when we see gods described as tyrannoi, it's often as an emphasis on power. So there is now, I can look up again, I can look up the reference, but it's a tragic fragment that I think refers to love, for example, as eros, as tyrannical. And again, I think that is what is being used, and again, I'll look up the text, but it is the power of love over everything. So it is quite an effective use of the word there. But then, of course, the main instance where gods are called Tyrannos, or a god is called a Tyrannos, is in the Prometheus bound, of course, as you know, attributed to Aeschylus, where there is again that it's used in actually quite a precise sense. This is Prometheus who has been constrained, who has been tied to this rock by someone who he says is a new ruler, a hubristic ruler. Of course, he's a young ruler who's taken over the entire cosmos, which is Zeus. So again, I think it's being used in a very specific sense. Now, I don't know, an expert on ancient religion may correct me, but I don't think Tyrannos is ever used as a cult title. Maybe there's some obscure cult that I don't know of. I'd be fascinated to know. But of course, Zeus is always, Basilius is a cult title for Zeus. And I think, if I may, again, just quickly pick up on the legitimization point that we were talking about before. I think we really do see, I mean, at least by the 4th century, when we've got people like Evagorus being in Cyprus, who is effectively a tyrant of Salamis in Cyprus, but he calls himself, he's very careful, and his son Nicocles also is very careful to only call himself Basilius. And they actually have developed quite a complex, system of titles, both for the family members of Evagorus. And I think this is an attempt at legitimation. And it's interesting to look at earlier tyrants, that both the avoidance of the word tyrant and the avoidance of anything connected with a sort of what we might call a personality cult. So, for example, no heads on coins. But when we're moving into the 4th century and then into the Hellenistic period, you've got people, tyrants, very much putting their heads on coins. And why are they able to do this? Well, it's because I think they've been transformed into basileis. And I think the cult of Alexander the Great also helps here. So we look at the coins of Hieron II or Agathocles. Agathocles calls himself Basilius on the coins, and he's got his head there. So I think that yes, it's maybe, again, it's slightly different. I'm not saying that I'm not disagreeing with Edward, but I think there's serious dichotomies, but there's also continuity. And I think, returning back to the gods question, again, it's the same thing. We address Zeus as Basilius. We don't call him Tyrannos, except in those specific instances. And again, it has to do with power. But I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Can I jump in here just quickly? I promise to keep my point short. Following up on Edmund's point, it's very interesting. For instance, Lucan of the Bosporus, who's mentioned in 4th century speeches, if you like Lucan, you call him Archon. If you don't like Lucan, you call him Tyrannos. And it's the same thing also with Dionysius, again, in the earlier period, Dionysius of Syracuse in the early 4th century. In inscriptions, he's never called Tyrannos. He's called Archon also. So obviously they're trying to have good relations with him, and if they want to have good relations with him, they give him a kind of veneer of standard in kind of constitutional regimes. The interesting thing is about Prometheus, which I think everybody, well, I don't know, it seems to be that the consensus now is that it's not by Aeschylus. At any rate, but that's not, doesn't really concern us here. The thing is that it's the first play of a trilogy. And I think that idea is that by the, again, people would argue, I think Griffiths would agree, that by the end of the trilogy, Zeus has changed his ways. And so there's a transformation from Zeus as the Tyrannos to Zeus as a legitimate ruler, who then recognizes the individual rights of Prometheus and in that way legitimates his rule and then gets rid of the idea of tyranny. And the problem is, of course, we're focused on that play because the Prometheus Bound is we have it complete, but again, we do have fragments of the other two plays. So to a certain extent, that kind of it's the exception which kind of proves the rule, I think, to support Edmund's point.
Thank you. Javier?
No, I think the question is, I mean, ruling is always legitimation. It requires legitimation in some form. So I mean,
it's the exception which kind of proves the rule. I think to support
the question
Edmund's
is about the kind of the changing
Thank you.
basis of legitimation. I think what is striking about modern dictators, in many cases, is that they don't want to claim the mantle of kingship. They don't want to say they're, descendants of a particular family, or have like what is it, the mandate of heaven, as in the Chinese emperor, but that they have consent somehow. So you see all these plebiscites in Hitler's during Hitler's time. You see the sort of the whole 1936 Constitution, Stalin's. It's a whole process of trying to get people to participate and to vote for the Constitution, which in turn legitimates the structure as on the basis of some form of popular consent or something, at least for the people as defined by the Communist Party, basically. So I think it is a striking change, the kind of the basis of legitimation, how it does move a bit.
Yes, Javier, I think you pointed out in your lecture as well that the number of states nowadays which don't say that they're democracies in some form or other. I mean, I think it's something like 2 or 3. They all claim to be people's republics or, democratic, whatever.
It's basically Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Brunei and a couple of others, perhaps. So.
And Ron Dworkin at some point says that all major ideologies now are in some sense egalitarian. Even sort of free marketers will justify what they're saying by the idea that people have equal rights, equal amounts of freedom. It's actually ties in quite well with this idea of Zagaria. But anyway, I think that sort of egalitarian consensus is also visible at the level of legitimization of what are obviously, in some sense, not democratic. What they're saying regimes. By the idea.
I wanted to ask you James,
actually ties in
a question which would connect, I think, what we are talking right now with what you brought in, which is the idea of free speech or sort of a free exchange of information. And perhaps maybe we could be a little risky here and take as a case study the COVID pandemic, because it's I mean, since the beginning there were those claims made in the public debate that, for instance, China was able to contain the pandemic by the use of authoritarian measures, while democracies across the world have faced a serious problem caught in this dilemma of trying to protect the health of the citizens on the one hand, on the other hand being tied up by the political rights and liberties of their citizens, not to mention the 4-year election, the sword of Damocles hanging over the head. But maybe you could expand a little bit on that in connection to your research on ancient Isagoria. I mean, just an example of how the big tech media introduce a certain control system over the flow of information. For instance, I guess Facebook or YouTube, they use this phrase legally, vaccine hesitancy. So any kind of information which will cause vaccine hesitancy is to be controlled. That's interesting from many angles as a case study of how democracy tries to control the flow of information, and your thesis would be that it's actually not a good thing. So
yeah, I mean, okay, there's a lot there.
I don't want you to get too political or too specific.
I'll talk about COVID without saying anything controversial, but I mean, one place we can start is, I mean, what I was saying in my lecture about, democracies being better at warfare, because they're better at taking information and having a public discussion and things. It should be generalizable to sort of lots of other things, right? Because if it is true that being open to criticism and having open discussions leads to better results, then that should apply not just to warfare, but to lots of other things, the economy and, protecting human rights. And there's a big literature on this, and Xavier probably knows it better than me, but basically it seems to be the case that democracies, liberal democracies in particular, are associated with lots of good things. They're associated with prosperity, they're associated with longevity. There are certain demographic associations as well in terms of family size and so on and so forth. So there seems to be quite a good correlation between democracy and development. And I think maybe one of the best books I read on that was the statistical analysis of Adam Przeworski, who's a Polish-American political science. So I'm talking about associations because, again, as always in these statistical cases, it's difficult to know which way the causation goes. Is it just the case that these societies are all rich? And that's, because they're prosperous or because they're European or whatever, for whatever reason, they have all these good results. In other words, it's not democracy that's driving it. And I think that in the past we've I think there probably is, my suspicion is it probably is some kind of a causal link. But I think in the past it's been very easy to say, oh, what's driving all these good results is liberal democracies, because it just so happened that most of the rich, well-developed countries in the world were liberal democracies. And we've seen now, I think, some threats to this. One is in the form of the oil-rich nations, which have actually long been a problem. Oh, what's driving all this? Because you can have, in Saudi Arabia and other regimes, especially in the Middle East, you can have some very autocratic places which actually have an incredibly high standard of living. And then the other great threat to this, which I think is an even bigger one, is China, communist China now, because after the market reforms of the 80s, they've become very, very wealthy. And, relatively, of course, they're not that wealthy in terms of GDP per capita, but it's clear that they're on their way up, and they've shown that you can have a state that's sort of well on its way to modernity in terms of development on various measurements, including education for girls, all these things that we like to think our liberal democracies are particularly good at. In fact, China seems to do better than India, and that's a bit of a reversal, because the great Indian political scientist Amartya Sen pointed out something about democracies, which is that it seems to be the case that democracies are very good, even if they're not driving the sort of high-end performance. They're very good at stopping disasters. They're very good, in particular, at stopping famines. So Sen famously argued that democracies never really have famines, or very few compared to autocracies, and that's just because democracies are quite good at protecting. Just to go back to this distinction that Edward raised, they're very good at protecting people's negative rights. They're very good at protecting people's sort of rights to life and things like that, because they actually give people positive rights. In other words, the mechanism that allows people not to be oppressed by their governments or to be sort of left to starve by their governments are exactly the things like voting and taking part that Constant and others thought were just a feature of the ancient world. Okay, so Amartya Sen argued that, and he said, democracies are very good at avoiding disaster, and we have these associations between democracy and prosperity, which suggests that democracies are also very good at kind of driving you towards the high end of human development. But then, as I say, you have this big threat from China, and it seems like the coronavirus crisis in particular has been an episode where everybody looked at China and thought, oh my goodness, they're handling this so well. They've managed to completely obliterate it. They've shut down, and we can't do that in the West, and that's kind of a shame. And I'm not sure if we got this right, actually. And Neil Ferguson, not the historian, but the modeler at Imperial College London, there's a notorious quotation from him where he says something like, "We didn't think we could do that in the West, but actually we've managed to do that." And what he means by that is to have these very strict lockdowns. So I think it's very interesting, because I think that this challenge from China has been so much more powerful than people. The ideological challenge from China has been much more powerful than people thought. And if I just go back a few years ago, there were books coming out by people like Daniel Bell, a Canadian neo-Confucian, really, scholar. I would call him a neo-Platonist. He published a book about the China model. And his claim there was that, China is just better at organizing things. It's meritocratic, and it's going to prove that there's another way of getting to sort of high-end modernity, which is much more effective than the West. And I think, when it was published, I just sort of thought, well, that's silly. And I think that now people are buying into this claim in the West, especially sort of at the elite level, quite readily, that, yeah, actually China is doing this better than us. So, I mean, on that note, I just sound a few notes of caution. One is just that these mechanisms that I was talking about in my lecture, the Tyrant's Dilemma, are still operative. And so I'm not going to say that there aren't good things that the Chinese government has been able to do, but I will suggest that you can't always believe everything that the Communist Party of China puts out, and that applies to other authoritarian regimes. And we've seen this, I think, also even with the coronavirus. So it probably is true that they've managed to get numbers down quite effectively, but there are other authoritarian states around the world who've declared, we had basically no coronavirus. I think Belarus was like this for a while, and actually we think, they probably did. And of course, now I think it's becoming more clear that whatever exactly the origin of the virus was, there wasn't an open discussion about that, and the Chinese government was quite active in trying to make sure there was an open discussion about that. And that, I think, that will have consequences, and it already has had consequences for the way the global community's gone about this. So in conclusion, I guess I would say, yes, you can if you have a well-functioning authoritarian state, it's not going to be a complete disaster. There are ways in which you can do it well, and arguably the Chinese Communist Party has been doing it well on those measurements. But these mechanisms are still very much operative, and there's always this problem with negative rights, right? That people say, China can build all these great skyscrapers. It could just go in and do these things. It can just close people down. You can just imprison people in these blocks of flats where they're not even allowed to sort of go out and buy food. Isn't that amazing? And I always sort of think, not really, because you have to also build in the question of, well, what about these negative rights? What about people's freedoms? The reason that it takes us so much longer to build Crossrail or great engineering projects in democratic countries is partly because of those rights that Edward was talking about. We have to take into account people's property rights. We have to consult them, and to my mind, that's an efficiency loss that's worth having.
Thank you, James. We have a question from the audience. David Carter.
Hello. Yes, I just perhaps just follow that up with James and try an idea out on him, which is quite an obvious one. Is this point that democracies do better easier to make in the ancient world than the modern world for simple reasons of scale? In other words, could people claim that vast bureaucratic modern states can be run just as efficiently or more efficiently by autocratic regimes? Whereas in the ancient world, the virtue of deliberation is something that actually worked rather nicely in a smaller scale city-state.
Yeah, thanks. It's a difficult question. I mean, I think that in terms of the sort of epistemic angle, like, is it easier to see whether states work better in the ancient or the democratic states work better in the ancient or the modern world? I think it's actually much easier to see what's going on in the modern world just because we have better data. Yeah, so you can do the kind of statistical analysis that Jaworski and others have done. I think that in terms of the sort of the ancient world, I mean, I'm one of the people who've kind of tried, and it always ends up looking a bit sort of amateurish, partly because, we're sort of compiling lists of, how many ships city-states have and things like that. And it just doesn't have the same data, doesn't have the same granularity. But then on the substantive question, so sorry, you were saying that in the ancient world, democracies might be easier to run because they're smaller and allows for sort of more smaller scale deliberation. Is that right?
Well, I suppose your point in a way is about deliberative democracy. It's about the ability for people to question ideas and share information. Now, that's a virtue wherever you happen to be. But this is not something I necessarily believe. I'm just trying this idea out on you. If you happen to live in a city-state where people have a lot more personal contact and ordinary people are much bigger players in the day-to-day running of the city, could that deliberative virtue be more prominent, be a more telling factor in the success of the city than perhaps it might be in a vast bureaucratic modern state, where actually autocracy might do just as well as democracy, simply because the key to success is not deliberation so much as organisation, I suppose. And so, while I found your point about democracies doing better very persuasive, your subsequent point that China, for example, presents a challenge to that view might be explained purely in terms of scale.
Yeah, no, I mean, the scale question is a big one, not only for the discussion about, democracy versus autocracy, but also for the discussion about ancient direct democracy versus modern representative democracy. Because this is one of the things that the American founders were clearly very concerned about, if you read the Federalist Papers. I mean, Madison famously thought that it was going to be a virtue of representative democracy that there were more people around, but also thought the discussion about that might help ancient direct democracy versus modern the development of faction, which was another, because this is one of the things that the American concerns were clearly very concerned about. I actually read the Federalist Papers. I'm reasonably radical to the extent that I think that even in larger societies, we could have had more of a principle of subsidiarity and had a sort of more direct democracy at local levels in the way that Switzerland does it. So I think it's not impossible to have that kind of deliberation more embedded than we have it today. There's another thing which is going on today, of course, which is that I think that with social media that Mateus mentioned and sort of mass communications, we've sort of done this experiment that a lot of the great liberal thinkers, a lot of the great deliberative Democrats, Habermas and people like that, have been sort of urging on us and saying, why don't we sort of discuss everything? We govern everything by discussion. You have all this information coming in from every angle. And I mean, my talk was basically along those lines, right? That, the more information we have, the better. This is Greg Lukianoff's pure informational theory of free speech. The more we know about people's preferences, the better. And I think that, the results from social media are mixed at best, right? So I don't want to completely discount the positive aspects of this, because there are positive aspects of it. But it's very obvious to anyone with a brain, I think, at this point, that there are also a lot of pathologies which occur on social media. And to be honest, they're actually some of the same pathologies that I think critics of the democracy like Thucydides were warning against in ancient Athens. Things like reputational cascades. People just go along with what other people are signaling rather than thinking for themselves and inputting what they really think into the system. So yeah, I mean, there are problems at this point. I still do think it works better than extremely repressive systems like Saudi Arabia. And well, as for China, let's just say we'll see what happens. In terms of competition with more open societies, and we'll see what happens as China becomes wealthier, and whether people won't start to demand the kind of negative rights we've taken for granted in the West.
Okay, thank you. So we've come to the end of our time, but I think what we're going to do right now is to extend our meeting for a couple of minutes. And so I would like to ask first Edward and then Javier because you wanted to comment on the discussion. So first Edward and then Javier, and maybe Javier, you could also use your time to sort of answer briefly a question. Do you think it would be good to come back to the use of the concept of tyrannos and tyranny? Given your research on the evolution of the ways we talk about things. So, and then you could sort of finish our discussion with replying to this. But first, Edward.
Yeah, I'm going to try to keep my comments very brief, but I have several things to say. As far as James goes,
of the ways we talk about,
given the difference between China and the U.S., and I actually want to give James some positive kind of evidence. On the one hand, in terms of lockdowns and things like that, yes, China is perhaps more successful for various reasons. Maybe it's because more totalitarian society. But in terms of the development of vaccines, it's actually been the United States which has been more successful because, one, they have free enterprise system, and we have some excellent kind of companies which have been developing different vaccines very rapidly. And we also have, because we have free speech, and we also have free universities, there's been much better research. So on the one hand, one might make an argument that for one aspect. The other thing is also autocracies can do very well short term, but then there's a question of long term. For instance, the Nazi regime was very successful short term, but it was not successful kind of a long term. We can get into the different reasons for that. The other thing is also in terms of warfare. I just wonder to what extent democracies, when they're successful in war, are successful because tyrannies. For instance, in the beginning of the Civil War in the United States, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus because he said it was an emergency situation. In 1862, when Lincoln came up with the Emancipation Proclamation, it was, a lot of people thought it was tyrannical because he was doing it as a presidential decree. It wasn't done as a measure of Congress. Those came, the amendments, actually, the Constitution came later. And for instance, also in the UK, during the Second World War, you had very high levels of taxation. You had price controls. You also had secrets. Bletchley Park was not an example of deliberative democratic deliberation, where the Enigma, again, machine was made, which made a big contribution. Again, so secrecy is very important in warfare. It's also very interesting that in the ancient world, one of the advantages of tyranny in the debate on constitutions in Herodotus is that it's easier to keep a secret for tyrants than it is, and that's very important. So again, I just pose that kind of as a kind of question. As far as Switzerland goes, just briefly, there is some direct democracy, but not in all cantons, only in about 2 or 3, in most not. On the other hand, one thing is about Switzerland is they use referenda much more frequently than in other kind of European countries. So the only other thing is about democracy in the ancient world and their record in warfare. Well, I'm not so sure. The Athens had the most powerful empire in the 5th century in 431. Thucydides tells us about its resources. It was almost wiped off the face of the map in 404. It also tries to it goes to ignominious defeat in 338 Chaironeia, and then also again at Cranon, loses their form of government. And I could go through the whole record in the 4th century. It's not a good record. There are reasons for this, and even Demosthenes actually, when he's talking about Philip, he says Philip is much better at warfare because he concentrates power. He's the treasurer, he's the general, he's the leader, and this gives him an incredible advantage again over democracy. But on the other hand, that could be an entire topic for another discussion. So I'm going to stop here and thank everybody for their contributions.
Just to go back to the point that James is making, I think in theory there is good reason to think something like there's an epistemic advantage to discussion and therefore to some form of discussion-based government. But the problem with the kind of epistemic view of democracy, of what it allows you to do, is that it's not clear that you need to have everybody involved, right? Like, I mean, there's probably some advantage to internal deliberation within the Chinese Communist Party rather than concentrating all power in the hands of Mao, rather than as it used to be during the worst, periods of the Cultural Revolution or something like that, right? So you can say that this is sometimes discussed in terms of variability, right? So the more concentrated power, you have more variability in outcomes. Maybe you get lucky and you hit on a good policy, or you get unlucky and you hit on a terrible policy. Democracies are sort of in the middle. But it's not so much that that discussion doesn't have an epistemic advantage. Perhaps that advantage is not necessarily about having everyone involved. The particulars of the who's involved in the discussion matter. But I mean, just to conclude, because we're time, Matthias asked me about returning to the word tyranny and tyrant. And I don't think it has gone away. We still speak about tyranny, and there are occasionally good reasons to speak of tyranny, especially when we want to emphasize that a form of government is sort of done for the private interest of a group or a person, and we want to emphasize sort of the personal nature of power and how it's used for personal reasons rather than for public reasons and so on. So I think there is often good reason to speak of tyranny. I don't know that it's an exclusive reason. Like, I think what I've been trying to say is that, yeah, we can speak of tyranny and about other things, and it would be useful for theoretical vocabulary to be fairly precise about these things. You know, we can speak about tyranny in some cases, and perhaps about dictatorship in others, and perhaps about authoritarian practices in other cases, and so on. And we can use this vocabulary to pinpoint specifically about what's wrong with particular forms of politics, rather than simply pulling it all into one particular terminology. Thank you.
Can I just step in just very quickly before we finish? Yeah, I've put a notice in the chat. Basically, if you're in London on the 9th of March, we have the University of Nottingham is organising a symposium talking about many of these ideas, including China and the US and the Thucydides trap in the House of Lords. Places are limited, but if you are interested, do please email me, and it'd be great to see any of you there. But that's all from me. Thanks.
Okay. Great. So thank you, especially to our four speakers for today's discussion. Very interesting, and for your participation in the series. And I also want to thank the audience for being there. And I hope and you can find the recording of the video on the YouTube channel of the Faculty of Polish and Classical Philology of Adam Mickiewicz University, if you want to commend it to your friends or acquaintances. Yeah, so we will stop at that. The next lecture, the 5th lecture by Mirko Canevaro from the University of Edinburgh, will be on the 2nd of March, and I will be sending information, and I guess towards the end of February. So thank you very much, and see you during our next lecture. Goodbye.
Bye.
Information, and I guess towards the end of February. So thank you very much, and see you during our next lecture. Goodbye.
Bye.